You've probably been to a late-night restaurant where the clock ticks past midnight and the streets outside grow silent. But have you ever wondered what happens after the doors close? When the staff heads home and the last customer finishes their meal, what lingers in the shadows? Tonight, we're diving into stories from the depths of the night, where strange occurrences blur the line between reality and something much darker. So sit tight, because these are the most terrifying things that happen in restaurants when the lights went out. Story 1. The Chef and the Phantom of the Abandoned Restaurant. Chef Thomas had always loved working late. There was something about the solitude of the kitchen in the stillness of the night that felt comforting to him. He'd inherited the old restaurant from his mentor, who had passed away under mysterious circumstances a few months before. The building was old, almost ancient. Its brick walls were chipped and faded. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the kitchen smelled of herbs and spices long ingrained in the air. The kind of place that gave off a sense of time standing still. Most people were too afraid to work in the restaurant after hours, but not Thomas. He had always been drawn to its charm, its history. He didn't mind the dim lights, the constant creaking, or the shadows that seemed to linger in every corner. It felt like home. But something changed that night. It had been a particularly slow evening, with only a handful of customers who trickled out long before closing time. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the final minutes of the night shift. Thomas had been working tirelessly in the kitchen, preparing the day's specials for the morning. He was used to the quiet, but tonight the silence felt different, thicker, almost. He paused for a moment, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Then he heard it. The faintest sound of a chair scraping across the floor in the dining room. He frowned, thinking it was a draft or the building settling, but the noise persisted. Slowly, he set down the knife and walked cautiously toward the dining room. The door to the main hall was slightly ajar, and the room was bathed in the dim glow of the last remaining light fixtures. The tables were still set from the last guests, each one pristine, untouched. And then he saw it. A chair in the far corner of the room was slowly moving, as though someone had just stood up and left. But there was no one there. His breath caught in his throat, but he shook it off. "It's just the wind," he told himself. But as he moved closer, a sudden coldness washed over him, a chill so sharp it made his skin crawl. The temperature in the room seemed to drop at least 10 degrees. In an instant, his breath fogged in the air and a sense of dread filled his chest. He glanced around, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The scraping sound had stopped, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. "Thomas." He froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was the voice of his mentor, the man who had taught him everything about cooking, the man who had vanished without a trace just months before. Thomas had never heard him speak like this, though. The voice sounded distant, as though it came from a place far beyond the walls of the restaurant, from somewhere deep in the building. "Why did you leave me?" the voice whispered again, now clearer. His heart began to race. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind him, but the room was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting along the walls like they were alive. His chest tightened as the voice continued to echo in his head, a constant presence that made his stomach churn. "Don't ignore me." Thomas tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the spot where the chair had been, still rocking ever so slightly as if someone had just gotten up. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him, the walls closing in, suffocating him. The whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. There was nothing except the figure, a shadow, standing in the doorway to the kitchen. It was tall, dark, and unmoving. Thomas blinked, his vision clouded by the overwhelming sense of dread. It was too much. The room was spinning. He felt dizzy, lightheaded. He couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The next morning, the restaurant was locked up tight. Thomas hadn't shown up for his shift, and his phone went straight to voicemail. No one had seen or heard from him. When the police arrived, they found nothing out of the ordinary. The restaurant was untouched. No signs of struggle. But the staff who worked there after hours swore they could still feel the presence of something, someone still walking the halls. Some say Thomas is still there, roaming the kitchen in search of something. Maybe redemption, maybe answers. And if you happen to find yourself there late one night, standing in the same kitchen where he last worked, you might feel the chill in the air, hear the scraping of a chair, and even hear a soft whisper. But the scariest part? You might not be alone. Not anymore. Story 2. The Waiter and the Woman Who Never Left. Late one night, in a luxurious restaurant nestled in the heart of a bustling city, the last of the patrons had left. The place, known for its elegant ambience, dim lighting, and exquisite cuisine, was now deserted, the only sound being the quiet clink of silverware being washed in the back. Ethan, a young waiter, was finishing his shift. He wiped down the tables, preparing to close the restaurant for the night. It had been a long day, but there was something about the late hours that always made him feel a strange sense of calm. That was until she walked in. It was nearly 1 a.m. when the heavy door creaked open and a woman stepped inside. Her footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space. The bell above the door chimed softly, but it sounded far too loud in the silence. Ethan looked up, a little surprised. It was well past the restaurant's usual closing time. She was beautiful, strikingly so, dressed in a long, flowing black dress, her features obscured behind large, dark sunglasses. Despite the hour, she looked as though she had just stepped out of a fashion magazine. She didn't speak at first. She simply stood by the door, scanning the dimly lit room with a kind of calm confidence. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something unsettling about her presence, something off, but he quickly pushed it aside as he walked toward her. "Table for one?" he asked, trying to sound friendly. The woman nodded, almost imperceptibly, and then took a seat at a table near the window. She placed her handbag beside her, but made no effort to take off her coat or settle in. As Ethan approached to take her order, he noticed that there was something odd about her. Her hands were delicate, but her skin was pale, almost ghostly. There was an aura of sadness around her, something in her posture, in the way she gazed out the window at the empty street. But he couldn't place it. "What can I get you?" he asked, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. She looked up at him, her eyes hidden behind the large glasses, and smiled faintly. "I'll have the special, please, and a glass of red wine." Her voice was smooth, soft, almost too calm, but there was something about the way she spoke that made him uneasy. Ethan didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and left to place the order in the kitchen. When the meal was prepared and brought to her table, she didn't touch it. Instead, she stared out the window, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Ethan watched her from the corner of the room, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When he returned to check on her, the room had grown even quieter. Her plate was untouched, and she hadn't moved. The strange, unsettling air hung around her like a cloud. He approached cautiously, hoping to ask if everything was okay. But when he opened his mouth to speak, Her voice cut him off. "Are you afraid?" she asked, still not turning to face him. Ethan froze. Her words felt like a weight pressing on his chest. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond, then finally said, "Afraid? Of what?" "Of me," she whispered, her voice now colder, more distant. Ethan's heart began to race. He tried to brush it off his nerves as the kind of strange energy that sometimes happens late at night. But as he turned to leave, the woman spoke again. "You'll understand soon," she said, her voice now barely audible, almost a whisper. I never left. The words hung in the air as Ethan made his way back to the kitchen, but the eerie feeling clung to him. He tried to shake it off, but it wouldn't go away. He didn't want to look back, but curiosity got the best of him. He turned around, expecting to see her sitting calmly, waiting for him to bring the check. But she was gone. The table was empty. No purse. No coat. Nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He rushed to the front door, expecting to see her walking down the street, but the night was still. There was no sign of her anywhere. She had disappeared. Completely. Confused and shaken, Ethan walked back to the table. There was no evidence that she had ever been there. No crumbs. No stains. Just an untouched plate of food, sitting in the middle of the table, still steaming. But as he began to clear the table, he noticed something strange. A napkin, folded neatly in the middle of the plate, had a note written on it. Ethan unfolded it, his hands trembling. "You will see me again, when you least expect it." A cold shiver ran down his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned around, half expecting to see her standing behind him. But the restaurant was empty. It was then that he realized the woman had never left, and perhaps she never would. Story 3. The Last Order of the Vanished Customer. It was the kind of diner you might drive past without a second thought. Located just off the side of a lonely highway, it was the sort of place where the neon lights flickered intermittently, and the smell of greasy comfort food filled the air. The sign outside read, "Open 24 hours," and though it didn't attract many customers, it always seemed to be open no matter the hour. Tonight was no different. Mary, a young waitress who had been working the late shift for a few months, was used to the quiet. The diner was almost empty, save for the occasional truck driver or late-night traveler looking for something to eat. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 a.m., the hours dragging by with little excitement. Most of the regulars had already finished their meals and left, and the diner was eerily silent. Then, just as she was about to clean the last table, the door creaked open. A man stepped in, his face obscured by the dim light from the sign outside. He was tall, with a heavy coat that looked out of place for the season. He looked worn, his clothes faded, and his eyes, there was something off about them. Dark, almost hollow, like they had seen too much. His hair was graying, and his skin looked unnaturally pale, as if he hadn't seen the sun in ages. He took a seat at the counter, without saying a word, his eyes never leaving the menu in front of him. Mary glanced over, noting his strange demeanor, but figured he was just another weary traveler. She walked over to him and asked, "What can I get you?" Without looking up, he replied in a hoarse voice, "Just a burger, fries, coffee." His voice had a strange edge to it, as though he hadn't spoken in a long time. Mary didn't think much of it. She took his order, went to the kitchen, and returned with his meal. The man hadn't moved. He was still sitting there, staring at the menu as if it held some sort of secret. She set the plate in front of him and asked if he wanted anything else. He didn't respond. His hands were wrapped tightly around his coffee cup, his knuckles white, as if he was holding on for dear life. Something about the scene made Mary feel uneasy, but she dismissed it and went back to the kitchen, hoping the night would end without incident. But as the hours went by, the man didn't touch his food. He didn't take a sip of his coffee. He just sat there, staring into nothing. The occasional truck passed outside, its headlights flashing through windows, but the man didn't react. It was as if he didn't even notice the world around him. Mary tried to ignore the growing sense of dread gnawing at her. She glanced at him several times, wondering why he hadn't eaten or even moved. It felt as though time had stopped in the diner, and the only thing that existed was the man at the counter, locked in his own world. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She approached him again, nervously asking if everything was all right. "Sir," she said softly, "is everything okay with your meal?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned his head to look at her. His eyes, cold and lifeless, met hers, and for a moment it felt as though the air itself had thickened. She swallowed hard. "Are you okay?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm waiting," he said, his voice barely audible. "For what?" Mary asked, her stomach churning. The man stared at her for a moment, his lips twitching into something like a smile. "For when it's too late." Mary's heart skipped a beat. The diner felt colder all of a sudden, the air heavy, like the walls were closing in on her. Something wasn't right, but she forced herself to smile, offering a polite nod before quickly retreating to the kitchen. When she came back to check on him a little later, the man was gone. The plate of food was still there, untouched. His coffee was still steaming, but the man himself had disappeared. She rushed to the door, looking outside, but there was no sign of him. No coat on the seat, no footsteps in the snow. It was as if he had never been there at all. Mary stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. Then she noticed something on the counter where the man had been sitting. A napkin, folded neatly, with a message scrawled on it in dark ink. "The shadows are waiting. You'll see me again." Mary felt a cold shiver run through her. She stared at the note for what felt like an eternity, before finally mustering the courage to pick it up. She had no idea what it meant or who the man was, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker had just happened. The police were called, but no one could find any trace of the man. There were no missing persons reports, no evidence he had ever entered the diner. As the days passed, it felt as though the entire incident had been a figment of her imagination. But every night, when Mary closed the diner and looked out the window, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching her. And sometimes, late at night, she swears she hears the soft scrape of a chair moving just outside the diner's door. Sometimes, the most terrifying things aren't the things you can see, but the things that stare back at you in reflection. The diner was small, nestled along an empty stretch of highway, a place where weary travelers would stop to stretch their legs and get a bite to eat. But for Carla, a young woman who had just moved to the area and recently started working there, the place felt oddly comforting, even at night when the other patrons had long gone. It was a slow shift, one of those nights when the air seemed to hang still and the lights of the diner flickered in that strange, rhythmic pattern. Carla had worked long enough to know the quirks of place. The way the windows would sometimes fog up despite the air conditioning, the old jukebox in the corner that seemed to play by itself when no one was near, and the constant clicking of the coffee machine, even after it had been turned off. But none of that ever really bothered her. Until tonight. It was just after midnight when she was wiping down the counter, preparing to close up, As she glanced around, her eyes landed on the old mirror behind the counter. It was a large framed piece, scratched and weathered by time, but had always been there. Every night, Carla would briefly catch a glimpse of herself in it. But tonight, something was different. The reflection seemed off. Not in a way that was immediately noticeable, but there was something about it, something that made her stop in her tracks. She took a few steps toward the mirror, narrowing her eyes as she studied the reflection. At first, it looked the same: the counter, the chairs, the empty booths. But as she peered closer, something shifted in the glass. She blinked, but it was still there. A woman, standing at the far end of the diner. Her figure was hazy at first, almost translucent, but as Carla's heart began to race, the woman became clearer. She was tall, with long dark hair cascading down her back, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress. Her features were indistinct, but Carla could see her staring directly at her. It wasn't a casual glance. The woman's eyes were wide, locked on Carla as if she was waiting for something. Her lips parted slightly, as though to speak, but no sound came from the mirror. Carla's breath hitched. Her pulse quickened. She turned around quickly, half expecting to see the woman standing behind her in the diner, but the place was empty, still, silent, as it should have been. There was no one there, only the reflection in the mirror. She walked closer, heart pounding, and in the reflection, the woman in the white dress seemed to take a slow step forward. Carla froze. The woman was no longer standing at the far end of the diner. She was closer now, just on the other side of the counter. Carla's blood ran cold. The woman was still staring at her, but her expression had changed. Her face was twisted in an agonizing mix of fear and something darker, as if pleading for help, or maybe for something more sinister. Without thinking, Carla turned back toward the counter, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. But the moment her gaze flicked back to the mirror, her breath caught in her throat. The woman wasn't the reflection anymore. Instead, it was Carla, but the reflection wasn't quite right. She looked different. Her eyes were wide, almost frantic, her mouth twisted in an unnatural way, and there was something cold, something hollow, deep inside her stare. The reflection of herself smiled, but it wasn't her smile. It was a grin, a twisted, malevolent grin that made Carla's stomach turn. The reflection didn't move with her. It just stayed there, its eyes locked onto Carla's, and the grin grew wider. Her pulse raced as she tried to step back, but her feet felt frozen to the floor. The reflection continued to stare at her, its smile never fading, its eyes never leaving hers. Carla felt as though something was pulling at her from within the mirror, something that wanted to break free, something that wasn't her. In a panic, she turned, desperate to escape the reflection, but the mirror, something inside it, seemed to call to her. She could hear a voice in her head, faint but growing louder. "Help me, help me." It was a woman in the white dress. Carla turned back to the mirror in desperation. But the reflection wasn't just staring anymore. The figure in the glass was reaching out, as if it were trying to crawl out, its hands pressing against a mirror, fingers trembling as they reached for her. Carla let out a scream and ran. But as she reached the door, she could feel something heavy, something cold, brush against the back of her neck. She whipped around, but there was nothing. No woman, no reflection, just the empty diner. The door flew open, and Carla rushed out into the cold night air, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she looked back at the diner, she saw it. The reflection in the window wasn't hers. It was a woman in the white dress, standing behind the counter, staring out into the night, and she was smiling. Carla never returned to the diner. The next day, when the owner arrived to open up, he found everything as it should be: empty booths, clean tables, and the mirror, which had always been a part of the diner, hanging just as it had for years. But when he took a closer look at the mirror, he saw something that made his stomach churn. In the reflection, standing at the counter, was the same woman in the white dress, the one Carla had seen the night before. But this time, her eyes weren't wide with fear. She was smiling, her mouth stretched too far, her face unnaturally twisted. And as the owner gazed into the reflection, the woman's smile grew wider, more sinister, as if she had been waiting for him. He stepped back, terrified. The mirror had been there for decades, and no one had ever experienced anything strange until Carla had arrived. As the diner closed for the night, the staff noticed something even more unsettling. The mirror, once clear and bright, now seemed clouded, like something from the past was trapped behind it. They could no longer see their own reflections clearly, only distorted shapes moving in the glass. And in the reflection, there was always a woman in a white dress, standing still and watching. No one could explain it, and no one dared ask what it was that the woman wanted. Some say she's still there, trapped in the reflection, waiting for the next person to come close enough. Others say she wants to be freed. But one thing is certain: those who look into the mirror will never be the same again. And when you glance at your reflection, you'll wonder if what you're seeing is really you or if something else is looking back.